Now, after stating this kind of brief background of the conference and of the project of which this conference takes part, let me now introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker today is Arthur Bradley from Lancaster University. Apart from being my dear friend for a very long time, Arthur Bradley is professor of comparative literature at the University of Lancaster. He is the author of numerous books dealing with themes such as political theology, contemporary continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, structuralism, literature, and so on and so on. Most recently, he published a really great book. I had a chance to review. It's titled The Unbearable Life, A Genealogy of Political Erasure, which came out in by Columbia in 2019. And he has, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of in preparation forthcoming book, tentatively titled In the Theater of Sovereignty. Am I right? Perfect. And the title of his talk today is Unspeakable, Perversion, Psychoanalysis, Prosopopeia. And with this, I leave the floor to you, Arthur.
Okay, thanks very much, Bastian. In this paper, I want to tell you all why I'm so happy to be here today in Ljubljana. It's not because I enjoy talking about psychoanalysis or anything like that. As a matter of fact, psychoanalysis doesn't make people like me happy at all. We really have got nothing to say to the likes of you, and quite honestly, we find all your gobbledygook boring and ridiculous. To tell you the truth, I'm happy to be here at this symposium on perversion for one reason only. Yes, that's right, I'm a pervert. And if you psychoanalysts know anything about us perverts, it's that we're happy wherever we are. We perverts just love being perverts. We experience no lack, lost, or missing object. We exist in the now of a permanent jouissance rather than the infinite regress of the chain of desire. And we ask no question to which that subject supposed to know, called the analyst, is supposed to have an answer, because we already know the answer ourselves. For you psychoanalysts, we perverts belong to that set of hopeless, incurable cases that are deemed unanalyzable, like psychotics or the Irish. Did I mention that I'm Irish as well, by the way? In our pathological happiness, we seem to make you very unhappy indeed. But please don't be sad, because I'm here to teach you how you can be more like us. One more effort, psychoanalysts, if you want to be perverts. To speak in the voice of the pervert, which I'm going to be trying to do more or less unconvincingly in this paper, we inevitably find ourselves performing the classic rhetorical act of prosopopeia, whereby an imagined, absent, or dead person or thing is represented as speaking or acting. It might be possible to see the entire history of psychoanalysis as a series of more or less convincing ventriloquisms of the master's voice, whereby Lacan speaks for Freud, Zizek for Lacan, and so on. But arguably, the pervert alone remains, in every sense of the word, unspeakable. As is well known, perverts pose a peculiar empirical problem for the analyst, insofar as they rarely present themselves for analysis in the first place, and so can only be spoken for. For psychoanalysts, though, perverts also constitute a serious theoretical problem for the analytic process itself, because their real problem is that they seem to have no problem with their problem. Or even worse still, they may not have a problem at all. They simply exist, Zen-like, in the silence of pure jouissance. If the pervert unproblematically enjoys their symptom, their state of blissed-out beatitude threatens to render the analyst both figuratively and literally redundant. What 19th century psychiatry diagnosed as the incurable pervert who is happy in their perversion may thus be the harbinger of that other aggressively anti-psychoanalytic figure who can be found at the other end of the Freudian century, namely the serotonin-enhanced subject of modern psychopharmacology. In this unhappy state of affairs, perversion not only, quote, disappears on the couch, as Jacques-Alain Miller puts it in a classic essay, but also threatens to make the couch itself disappear. This paper is a set of perverse speech acts written in dialogue with Miller's essay on perversion on the asymmetrical relationship between the pervert and the analyst. To be sure, Miller's talk may be read as the classic, even symptomatic act of perverse prosopopeia, because, despite or because of the pervert's acknowledged inaccessibility to analytic scrutiny, Miller proceeds very happily to analyze this most unanalyzable of subjects. It's no problem at all that the pervert, quote, doesn't ask to undergo analysis, nor that they, quote, cannot communicate their knowledge of sexual enjoyment to others, nor even that they prefer the company of, quote, a tiny secret society of initiates to the presumably endless cocktail party that is the social life of a Lacanian psychoanalyst. As Tim Deans argues, none of this matters at all, because the absence of perverts in analysis allows us to say whatever we like about them. And for Miller, what he wishes to say about the pervert is that their so-called happiness is really just the misrecognized, disavowed symptom of a pathology which, as Freud himself had argued almost a century earlier in his 3 essays, takes its pleasure from the wrong object. Quote, the pervert has found sexual gratification, Miller concludes, but it's not the right kind. Yet, it's possible to argue that Miller's essay also manifests a certain Unbehagen of its own, a wrong kind of happiness, and a wrong kind of happiness with its own happy prosopopeia of perversion. Perversion, he writes, throws the analyst's most intimate judgment into question, throwing into question the point up to which he himself, the analyst, has moved on the path of sexual enjoyment. If the analyst ultimately fails to convincingly ventriloquize the pervert, I want to argue in what follows that the reason for this may not be because the latter, the pervert, is incurably, unanalysably unspeakable, but rather because, and as Miller himself obliquely appears to suggest, the pervert ventriloquizes them. The pervert ventriloquizes the analyst. Perversity is itself a kind of prosopopeia, which is uncannily able to speak in the voice of analysis itself, and which, like all acts of ventriloquism, carries with it the existential risk of irony, parody, mechanical repetition, redundancy, and even death for its victim. In the remarkable conclusion to Miller's essay, where the subject supposed to know finds himself asking the question of their own enjoyment, and the subject who is supposed to have a question finds that they already know the answer, the pervert disappears from the couch, only to reappear in the analyst's chair. So who or what speaks in the voice of the pervert? So what follows are 3 perverse speech acts, all of which are quotations, more or less, from the history of psychoanalysis's engagements with perversion. And the first section is called How Very Interesting. In the same way as Michel Foucault's history of madness, the psychoanalytic history of perversion seems at first glance to be the history of a silence. It's already been noted by Deans, for instance, that Freud's case histories contain testimony from several hysterics, obsessional neurotics, one phobic, even a distinguished psychotic, but the pervert alone, arguably, never speaks in their own voice. At one level, of course, the early Freud's ambition is precisely to explode the 19th century sexological theory descending from Kraft-Ebing et al., that there is a generic psychosexual personality type called the pervert. everyone and everything, after Freud, is perverse. Yet despite or because of perversity's unspeakable universality, everything still proceeds in his early work as if there really were an individuated subject of perversion, typically diagnosed as the invert or homosexual, whose determined pathological symptoms can be made to speak for them. To recall briefly his essay on the sexual aberrations, Freud defines the sexual perversions as either, quote, A, actions of extending in an anatomical sense beyond the regions of the body that are designed for sexual union, or B, actions of lingering over the intermediate relations to the sexual object, normally rapidly traversed on the path towards the final sexual aim. If Freud's notorious definition of perversity is broad enough to encompass such apparently normal sexual practices as gazing, kissing, foreplay, and so on, he goes on to identify a qualitative threshold beyond which the normally perverse becomes pathological. What defines perversion as a pathological symptom is a certain spatial or temporal fixity, which leads it to not merely supplement, but to wholly substitute itself for the normalized sexual activity of heterosexual intercourse. In their pathological stuckness upon their enjoyment, which leads them to say no to any supposedly normal sexual object or aim, the pervert thus begins to speak their own symptom for the first time. To make the pervert speak for the first time in history, though, Freud himself must become the original, unhappy, discontented, perverse ventriloquist. It's already been observed by Arnold Davidson, amongst others, that his allegedly universal theory of perversion ironically ends up reproducing, albeit without the residual moralism, the discredited psychosexual subject positions of many of his predecessors. As the sexual aberrations makes clear, Freud's pervert still remains more or less synonymous with such historically overdetermined figures like the invert or homosexual, and arguably this gesture will persist into Lacanianism as well. The homosexual comes to speak for perversity in general. However, we can already begin to glimpse the ventriloquist's lips moving when Freud himself acknowledges that in the majority of cases, quote, we can only discern the pathological character in perversions, not in the content, Inhalt, of the new sexual aim, but in its relation, Verhaltnis, to the normal. For Freud, and this is obviously me talking here, and the pervert thus appears to occupy a kind of libidinal empty space, which subtracts itself from any determined psychosexual subject position or object choice into a pure and empty relationality. What they enjoy is not some positive sexual content, homosexuality et al., but as I've argued elsewhere, the negative virtual or potential set of relations between drives, attachments, and objects. If the pervert only exists in the interstices between libidinal subject positions, which is to say, as the possible extension, variation, supplementation, or substitution of every single position in the sexual field by every other, then they can occupy no normal or perverse position of their own. They are constitutively what is out of place. In the very historical moment when they're first called upon to speak in their own voice, Freud's pervert thus reveals themselves as a kind of libidinal Bartleby they would prefer not to say. In Freud's late case study, The Psychogenesis of a Case of Homosexuality in a Woman, a case which should, according to his own early criteria, be almost a textbook study in perversion, what we might call the perverse analysand's undiagnosability, as opposed to any positive symptomatic behavior, revealingly becomes their non-symptomatic symptom. To quickly recall Freud's account, the young woman, who is its subject, remains uniquely, among his case studies, anonymous. She is, quote, not in any way ill, and nor did she complain of her condition. She is, quote, both brazen and deceitful in her exhibition of her homosexuality. She has no desire to undergo analysis voluntarily and barely engages with the analytic process. She has, quote, never been neurotic and comes to the analysis without even one hysterical symptom. And indeed, by the end, it's not clear whether she's even homosexual, and the word pervert never appears anywhere in this text. It's thus hardly surprising that feminist and queer readers of this essay object that Freud reduces the young woman to a kind of ventriloquist's dummy for his own speculations about the alleged causes of female homosexuality. Yet I want to suggest that it's precisely in the unhappy gaps, or lacunae, the discontents, if you like, which haunt Freud's own relentless will to normalization, that the pervert, like God, may be found. For Freud, what comes to define the subject position of the pervert here is a kind of oscillation between other, more determined subject positions, speech acts or language games, and specifically between the positions of the hysterical and obsessional neurotic and what we will see to be their own defining enunciations of lying by telling the truth and telling the truth by lying. And I'll come back to that in a moment. If the pervert is thus characterized by a kind of undiagnosability, Freud's account of the young woman's curious engagement or lack of engagement with the analytic process itself perhaps helps us to glimpse why this might be. And here I come to my perverse speech act. Once, he says, when I expounded to her a specially important part of the theory, one touching her nearly, she replied in an inimitable tone, "How very interesting," as though she were a grande dame being taken over a museum and glancing through her lorgnon at objects to which she was completely indifferent. In Freud's normalizing interpretation, the young woman's purely academic interest in the process of analysis is a classic act of resistance. He calls it the analytic equivalent to the Russian tactics in warfare of retreating to a position that proves unconquerable. But it's at least possible to wonder whether her real position is ironically closer to the classic German military tactic of attacking what Clausewitz calls the enemy's Schwerpunkt, its center of gravity. Because what disarms Freud here is that the young woman who exhibits an analyst's theoretical or conceptual mastery of the analytic process, but signally lacks any sense that she personally is the one under analysis, that she is the analysand, the young woman is actually speaking in the voice of the analyst. Okay, the second perverse speech act is called I Always Lie. In On Perversion, Jacques-Alain Miller briefly laments that the pervert never presents themselves for analysis. Quote, "We might conclude that perverts are unanalyzable, but the fact is they simply don't come asking to undergo analysis." But then he immediately proceeds to speak of a figure called the perverse analysand. It's revealing that the Lacanian theory of perversion has perhaps even less of a basis in empirical observation than its Freudian predecessor. Lacan's classic example of a real-life perverse analysand would probably be the Marquis de Sade. As Miller himself observes, the psychoanalysts' hunt for the elusive figure of the pervert inevitably seems to lead them away from reality and into the field of literature. No other clinical structure, he says, involves as many literary references as perversion. But this insight never leads to any sustained reflection on why the privileged place of the pervert should be the place in which, by definition, literature, we can only ever speak on behalf of the other. To explain why perverts don't come to analysis in the first place, Miller speculates that they're the opposite of someone like a neurotic who presents themselves in order to seek out the lost object. The pervert believes they've already found their object and so can expect nothing from analysis. For Miller, every analysand needs, quote, a void or deficit in the place of sexual enjoyment. But the pervert experiences what I would call a void of enjoyment. The pervert has the answer, he writes, an immutable constant share that is always ready to use. It's an at-hand enjoyment. If the pervert does not need analysis because they're already happy, because they live in the world of instant gratification, they nonetheless, Miller argues, suffer from a lack of satisfaction with satisfaction itself. And in the analytic process, he predicts, the happy pervert would surely discover that their right object of pleasure was the wrong object all along, or even better, that every object is somehow wrong. And so, like every other unhappy analysand, they really do have a question to which the analyst may be supposed to have an answer. Quote, the pervert has found the object. That is his problem. He's certain about his way of obtaining sexual gratification, but that's not why he comes to analysis. Perhaps he feels it's not what it ought to be. He's found sexual gratification, but it's not the right kind. Either you find it or you don't, or either you don't find it, or if you do, it's not the right kind. To speak of this paradoxical, indeed almost oxymoronic figure of the perverse analysand, whose very lack of any reason to undergo analysis becomes the very reason why they need it, what Miller seems really to be talking about here is not a real empirical patient at all, so much as a kind of hypothetical, even fictional placeholder in his own thought experiment. It's inevitable that we analysts must end up speaking for perverts, because even on the vanishingly rare occasion that a real-life perverse analysand presents themselves at our clinics, they still remain curiously absent. Quote, either perversion disappears on the couch or the patient disappears from the couch. According to Miller's account of his own clinical practice, his patients, his perverse patients, are inevitably homosexuals again, who have courageously broken out of the diminishing circle of instant gratification to begin the process of seeking the truth of their desire. We are, he ventriloquizes his clientele, among the most honest, the most truth-seeking, the most self-searching of patients. However, the truth that Miller's perverse analysand has come to tell, paradoxically, is that all perverts are pathological liars. If perverts are empirically unanalyzable, then anyone who comes to analysis and claims to be a pervert is almost by definition not a real pervert, but something else, a neurotic, a psychotic, perhaps, even to recall Freud's encounter with the young woman once again, a kind of wannabe analyst who is engaging in a rash or precipitate act of self-diagnosis. And you find this in quite a lot of the literature. Bruce Fink makes the same point, that these people who claim that they're perverts turning up at your clinic turn out to be something else entirely. For Miller, in what could be almost a verbatim quotation from Freud's case study of the brazen but deceitful young homosexual woman, any patient who openly diagnoses themselves as a pervert is thus automatically suspicious. Quote, you mustn't take at face value the subject's announcement that he's homosexual. One man may believe he's homosexual because he slept with a boy once when he was 14. Another may believe he's not a homosexual, even though he sleeps with 2 or 3 different boys a week. In Judith Farah-Gurvich's verdict, which takes Miller's professional skepticism about the self-diagnosis of the perverse analysand to its logical conclusion, the only true pervert is the analysand who lies about being a pervert. Quote, I have not yet encountered the rare specimen who would admit to being a pervert. In their pathological commitment to telling the truth that they are lying, or lying that they are telling the truth, the perverse analysand thus becomes a kind of Lacanian equivalent to Aristotle's Cretan liar. I am a pervert, they tell their analyst, but all perverts are liars. To say a statement like, I am a liar, as Lacan reminds us in Seminar 11, we don't necessarily fall into Aristotle's logical contradiction, because there's always a structural gap or interval between the enunciating subject who speaks a statement in the first place and the subject of enunciation who is spoken of or about in the statement itself. I can still speak the truth that I am a liar without fear of self-contradiction, even or especially if the I that I happen to be speaking about is said to be the liar. It's the particular task of the analyst, Lacan argues, to retroactively construct the enunciating subject, who may well be telling the truth of their desire, from the subject of enunciation by an act of ventriloquism, which sends back the enunciation to the enunciator in an inverted form. Quote from Lacan, he says to him, in this I am deceiving you, what you are sending as message is what I express to you, and in doing so, you are telling the truth. As Slavoj Žižek elaborates, the liar's paradox typically expresses itself in 2 ways in analysis. A hysterical neurotic will lie about their desire by telling the truth. I really didn't kill him, officer, even though he's my worst enemy and I've been wanting him dead for years. Whereas an obsessional neurotic will speak the truth of their desire in the form of a lie. I hereby declare this meeting closed. Sorry, I meant to say open. For Miller, though, what's remarkable about the perverts he treats in his own clinic, who may or may not be telling the truth of their desire when they announce, "I am homosexual," is that they seem to shuttle undecidedly between the polarities of the hysterical and obsessive neurotic, between lying by telling the truth and telling the truth by lying, so that it becomes impossible to determine what, if anything, their true subject position may be. They are, so to speak, neither telling the truth nor lying. If the analyst seeks to ventriloquize the pervert's statement to reveal the truth of their desire, to give them back their own voice by speaking back to them, they are thus ventriloquizing what is itself an originary act of self-ventriloquism, of prosopopeia. In a paradoxical sense, the pervert never speaks in their own voice, but, so to speak, in place of, on behalf of, the pervert. Okay, and my final perverse speech act is that to say the analyst is a pervert? In taking the place of the subject who takes the place of the pervert, which I would argue is more or less the position occupied by Freud's young homosexual woman, as well as Miller's homosexual clientele, the pervert once again begins to encroach upon or occupy the subject position of the analysts themselves. Both claim to speak knowledgeably and authoritatively on behalf of the pervert. To explore this obscure structural affinity between the pervert and the analyst, which persists in spite or perhaps because of their mutual contempt, I want to conclude by returning to Miller's own conclusion to On Perversion, where he briefly hypothesizes about the possibility of what we might call a perverse analyst. Quote, "Let us conclude on this point," he tells his audience. "If the true pervert makes himself be objet A, we can very simply deduce from Lacan's formula why it is incompatible with analysis. The analyst in the analytic operation makes himself be objet A. Is that to say that the analyst is a pervert? Certainly not. It's at this point, unhappily, that we must begin to ventriloquize the ventriloquists themselves, because Miller stops at this point in his talk due to lack of time. As he's obviously recalling, though, the Lacanian pervert is characterized by the operation of disavowal, which leads them, as Bastian was saying, to become the instrument of the other's jouissance. Yet as Dominic Hoens, amongst others, also observes, this is precisely the position that the analysts themselves must take vis-à-vis the pervert. They must make themselves, via the process of transference, for example, the analysand's objet A. If the Lacanian pervert remains in some sense genuinely unanalyzable, however, Miller's remarkable conclusion here is that it may not be because they are far more aggressively resistant to analysis than the hysteric or obsessional neurotic, because what could be more analyzable, after all, than resistance, a strategy of resistance? But on the contrary, because I've been trying to suggest, because they are in a certain sense singularly open to, already in, analysis. The pervert, lacking any determined clinical position of their own from which to speak, usurps the classic subject position of the analysts themselves as the one who speaks for the pervert. In their most audacious act of self-prosopopeia, the pervert is unanalyzable because they're already speaking from the structural position of the analyst. They make themselves the instrument of the very subject who's supposed to be the instrument of them. To bring On Perversion to a close, Miller thus finally begins to speak about the pervert as a species of analyst. But this makes it all the more curious that he appears to disavow, and I use that term advisedly, the counterfactual hypothesis that the analysts themselves may also be a pervert. It's sometimes been argued that the Lacanian fixation upon the homosexual as a privileged form of the pervert is a manifestation of the very symptom they seek to diagnose in their perverse clientele, namely disavowal. I know very well that human sexuality is perverse. Deans parodies the Lacanian analyst. But all the same, only some subjects may be classified as perverts. Accordingly, it's tempting to diagnose Miller's simultaneous denial and admission of the possibility that the analysts themselves may be perverse as a symptom of psychoanalysis's own perversity, Quote, the analyst makes himself be objet A. Is that to say that the analyst is a pervert? Certainly not. Yeah, I don't want to go down the route of simply diagnosing the psychoanalyst as pervert here, which would risk confirming the rectitude of the diagnostic category of perversion in the first place, because Miller's essay adds one more cryptic voice to the dialogue between pervert and analyst I've been tracking. For Miller, any analyst who makes himself an objet A would presumably not be a real pervert because, as we saw earlier, they're only really speaking back the pervert's enunciation for them to reveal in inverted form what the latter is really saying. They are speaking the truth, in other words, of the pervert's own speech act. If Miller thus appears to be just another analyst ventriloquizing the pervert here, I'm also struck by the fact that what he's really doing in the conclusion of On Perversion is ventriloquizing the analyst, or more precisely, ventriloquizing the analyst's own act of ventriloquizing the pervert. He's speaking the truth of the analyst's own inverted statement or enunciation, the analyst makes himself be objet A, back to them in yet another inverted form. Is that to say that the analyst is a pervert? Certainly not. So who exactly is speaking for whom in this curious libidinal echo chamber? The pervert, the analyst, or perhaps just the la ça parle, just the it speaks of Prosopopeia itself? In ventriloquizing the analyst, ventriloquizing the pervert, ventriloquizing the analyst, Miller's essay perhaps symptomizes what we might call the prosopopophilia, the perverse love of Prosopopeia itself, that is a condition of being a speaking subject at all. I am always speaking for and as the other, even or especially when I am speaking as myself. In conclusion, though, I want to go back to what I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted. I'm here to make you happy. It's really my vocation in life, making people happy, and so I won't take no for an answer. After all, you and I have so much in common. We're both experts in our respective fields. We both prefer the company of our little group of initiates to the ridiculous moralism of normal society. And let's be honest, we both get our kicks in the same way, putting on masks, role-playing games, all that kinky stuff. To tell you the truth, though, what makes me happiest is making you happy. So please don't be shy about saying what it is you really want from me. I can be a psychotic, a hysteric, or a neurotic. I'm even willing to be the instrument of your jouissance, your very own petit objet A, if you want to talk dirty. And if you don't want to say anything at all, please don't feel embarrassed. I feel like we're getting to know each other so well now that I can already guess what you were going to say. And frankly, I think I can say it better myself anyway. In any case, please lie back on the couch and make yourself comfortable. I promise this won't hurt a bit. So, are you ready to be happy? Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur, for a great opening. We have kind of 15 minutes for questions, comments, disagreements. So, please.
Well, thank you very much, Arthur. That was a thoroughly enjoyable talk. One thing that I'm wondering about is why, in dealing with the blurring of the distinction between the pervert and the analyst, why you did not address another aspect of perversion that I think allows, at least for a Lacanian, to maintain a very strict distinction between the pervert and the analyst, such as to make it the case that it is extremely problematic to cast the analyst as a pervert, despite the idea of occupying the position of the objet petit a in the analytic process for the perverse analysand.
Yeah.
And this has to do with the idea of the subject supposed to know. And that, of course, one of the things that Lacan stresses about perversion is that the pervert does pose as the subject supposed to know how to enjoy or how to be happy, as you might put it. And that, of course, the analyst, on the one hand, has to accept that transferentially speaking, he or she will be put in this position by the analysand, although in the case of a perverse analysand, that would be a little bit different. But the analyst, it seems, really refuses to pose not only as the subject supposed to know in general, but even more specifically, not pose as the subject supposed to know how to enjoy. And that seems to be a crucial difference between the pervert who poses as, I am the holder of the keys to jouissance, I know how to enjoy, and I can initiate you, into, this form of happiness that you as a normal neurotic, have thus far proven unable to gain access to. And that the analyst really does principally refuse to, at any point, occupy that position of, I'm going to teach you how to be happy or how to enjoy. I mean, analysis, when Freud says, look, it just turns neurotic pathos into ordinary suffering, and that moreover, Lacan insisting too that, look, at the end of analysis, you're left to your own devices. What you do with this, is up to you. And I'm not here to teach you how to be happy. I'm not here to teach you how to enjoy. If that's what you wish to, do with the knowledge that you've produced in analysis, that's your business. But it seems as though there is, especially with the idea of the subject supposed to know, for Lacan, a very strict difference between the pervert and the analyst that makes it hard to blur the boundaries between them in the way that I sense that you want to do, or at least some of how you do this in the talk. Does that make sense?
That's very well said, and yeah, I accept that. I mean, I guess to speak back to you a little, I suppose. I mean, the first question is, what exactly is a perverse analysand? Okay, because I think there are, in my reading of the literature on perversion, there's this strange logic going on, which is, on the one hand, is that perverts don't come to analysis. They don't, they already have the key, they already have this at hand, just gratification. They simply will never turn up in the first place, right? That's where Miller starts. But then he automatically starts talking about the perverse analysand, And what exactly is that? And then there's also the question of, so is the pervert who enters into analysis still a pervert? Because what you're then saying is that they have a question, that they have an unhappiness or an unhappiness with their happiness. It's a kind of it's a sort of interesting moment. We could obviously we can talk more about this, so I often wonder what exactly analysts are talking about when they talk about the perverse analysand. That would be my first point. Sorry, did you want to come back? Or yeah.
Just briefly with regard to that, the non-Lacanian analysts who I know do sometimes see perverse patients, but they're coerced usually. It is, they end up with one of these individuals who has either been threatened with divorce or separation by a partner, or has gotten in trouble with the law, and that there is an actual, for instance, court mandate that they undergo some form of, one or more forms of psychotherapy, and of course, as coerced, the prognosis isn't good in terms of what they're going to get out of the process, but they do at least sometimes, at least by virtue of external circumstances, find themselves sometimes compelled to at least go through the motions of spending time, in the consulting room.
But then they're just doing what I'm saying, which is they're ventriloquizing the act of being a pervert, aren't they? They're saying, oh gosh, I really want to stop being really happy, because my wife tells me I have to, or the law tells me I have to. They're paying lip service at some level, aren't they? It's not their question that they're asking, it's someone else's question, I guess. I do take your point, though, being the first one in particular. Yeah.
Thank you, Arthur. You certainly made me happy, which I don't know if it speaks to my perversion or yours. But seriously, I mean, I do want to make the first point that it was somehow a perfect talk in that it completely spoke to its topic by being perfectly clear and as such somehow impenetrable, which is somehow interesting. It was really perverse in that sense, I thought. So my only way in is to take somehow a look outside a little bit and ask if what you were describing, at least in one part of your talk, doesn't speak really to the perverse core of sexual normativity as such, by which I mean, let's go to incest directly. Right. And so we know, we have to ban some activity, which is the way for sexuality to somehow signal its own perversion, right? We cannot pinpoint what it is precisely that is fucked up about sexuality. It somehow doesn't work out. And so, okay, this is wrong. This is somehow, but then the point would be to ask you, if this is such a deep societal process, if this, what you described, speaks to what society does with perversion, can we introduce a gap there between psychoanalysis and just the way it is? Did I...
Psychoanalysis, sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm saying that the way you described perversion in psychoanalysis, to my mind, somehow is a good description of what sort of the structural position of perversion at large, right? The way in which, because as psychoanalysis teaches us, sexuality as such somehow is perverse, doesn't really fit its own concept even, one has to find some particular act that it changes, of course, that to ban, to say this is the one that is truly perverse. Yeah. So this is somehow how we try and fail to stabilize sexuality. And so just my question, this is an observation maybe, just that you are making a broader point maybe than just, between the analyst and the analysand. And then I'm asking if this at all helps you to introduce some gap there. I mean, is there a function there of psychoanalysis in relation to that? Does that make sense as a question?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I'm sorry if it didn't.
I'm not sure if I can answer that. I mean, in some ways, I think what I'm talking about is an internal dialogue that psychoanalysis is having with itself. Whatever is out there in the real world, that we call really existing perversion, like really existing Marxism, I'm not sure whether it ever enters the analytic room. I'm kind of Foucauldian about it, and I would say that the pervert is a category that comes into existence sometime in the 19th century, with people like Krafft Ebing and so on, where they had to invent a normality, they had to invent a concept of perversion. Incest, I don't know. I mean, Levi-Strauss seems pretty good on incest to me. Psychoanalysis is, yeah. I mean, this is a footnote to a footnote, but there is a really interesting dialogue to be had between perversion and Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology, because actually in Miller, when he's talking about the Freudian drives, and the actual terms that he uses to talk about them is the raw and the cooked. He's talking about the difference between the so-called natural and the symbolic and so on. But the actual language he uses is from Levi-Strauss. So that's really interesting, but I'm not sure if that helps at all. Thanks, Yuval.
Thank you, Arthur, for illuminating this part of Miller's text. I think the text was always very perplexing for me too, and I don't have the right answers. I would just kindly ask you to elaborate more further, because I was interrupted and I didn't and wasn't able to hear why did you introduce Aristotle's logical square. Just to give you a hint, I really cannot elaborate on this, you know. I think that the problem with Miller's in years, in decades, is that he is constantly shifting from the universal to the general. Yeah. And the categories, for instance, the clinical categories, for instance, psychosis becomes psychose ordinaire, becomes somehow everywhere. And the same applies to perversion, etc. So, you know, you have the general perversion, you have the general psychosis, everything is so general and everywhere. And at the other side, there's a singular view, which is somehow equated with the jouissance, enjoyment, and the last of courses he gave was learn to seul, one, the only one, the alone one, and this somehow continuates the troubles he has with positing psychoanalysis in the society. So how to properly how to understand narcissism and, you know, the problems we have in hyper-modernity, etc. And I was just wondering, why did you introduce Aristotle here? And it would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll send you a copy of the paper, but I was really just talking about, and this was a series of empirical observations that analysts make in the process of their analysis, is that the pervert who rocks up to your clinic is almost by definition everything they say is untrustworthy and a lie, you know, including the statement "I am a pervert." And the analysand who says "I am a pervert" is almost by definition not a pervert, you know, at least according to a couple of people. So your second point about the relationship between the universal and particular, I think, is really, really important, and I've actually written another essay on this called "What is General Perversion?" because I think the relation of perversion to generality and the relationship between so-called general and so-called particular perversions is aporetic to put it, or complicated to put it in a simple way. The perversion is really invented as a concept by the sexologists to try and say, well, what on earth do all these people like homosexuals and pedophiles and sadists and masochists, what do they have in common? They got to have something in common. So let's invent something called perversion, which will be a deviation from the normalizing sexual instinct, okay? So the invention of perversion as a general category itself is somewhat problematic. But secondly, and more interestingly, I think, is that perversion itself is a work of generalization. And this is something I was trying to hint at in the paper, actually, even in Freud's own discussion of perversion, is that perversion is sort of contentless. It's always that which is deviating from any specific content at any specific moment in time. In a weird sense, perverts are sort of libidinal structuralists, if that makes any sense. And if you go back to Kraft-Ebing, if you read the Psychopathia Sexualis and things like that, what's really interesting about these guys is that they're collectors, actually. It's all about putting themselves in boxes, putting themselves in groups of initiates, comparing themselves, taxonomizing themselves against other groups of perverts. So in a weird sense, the attempt to taxonomize perversion, to come up with a general theory of perversion, is always going to run up against perversion's own act of generalization. It's self-generalization.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'll elaborate a bit about Prosopopeia. I think it's crucial in the question of perversion. I mean, if I exaggerate a bit, is it possible to say that the most perverse here is actually Prosopopeia? And could it be possible even to think about Prosopopeia without thinking about perversion already. And already at the beginning, when Quintilianus was writing about Prosopopeia in Institutio Oratoria, it was this question, which is crucial also for what you were talking about, who's actually speaking here?
Yeah.
And isn't it Prosopopeia or this perverse Prosopopeia that is actually speaking here?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, prosopon is face, it's also mask, it's to mask, and so on. So there is a kind of weird perversity already at work in that act of Prosopopeia, yeah.
It works? Okay. Thank you for what I would dare to call a very neurotic talk.
Thank you.
I mean, the neurotic theater is impeccable. But just picking up a few threads, I'll try to be brief. I mean, I very much agree with Peter about Miller and clinicians tending to generalize phenomena, sometimes to a point of indistinction. However, I think there is a possibility that's been left out, which I'm sure will be picked up later in the day, but let me try to synthesize, which is that, in fact, we are dealing with two sides of the same coin with neurosis and perversion in several different senses. So to actually take them as separate structurations, is, while not untrue, perhaps, is not the point, at least starting with Lacan. And I'm thinking of one particular Lacan quote from Encore, I think seventh lesson maybe, that more or less neurosis has nothing to do with perversion because neurosis involves dreaming, whereas perversion involves acts.
Yeah.
And indeed, in the same seminar, Lacan goes specifically to say that not only do we all have a kind of polymorphous perversion, but also that the act of love is the male's polymorphous perversion. The act of love,
Yeah.
right? So putting these pieces together, and there are other citations that you could take, how are they two sides of the same coin? Well, we've already explored the option, okay, a neurotic who's lying, who's pretending to be a pervert. Even early Lacan explores the option of someone who seems to be neurotic, a phobic, little Hans, but who has a quasi-perverse solution. I mean, mainly the point of the end of Seminar 4. But what we haven't explored is the idea that actually perversion is simply an act that a neurotic can very well take on, given the correct staging, let's say, mise en scène. And this is maybe what will support, to use a thesis of a friend of mine and a student of Alenka's, an ordinary perversion that's not simply a general perversion, because the circumstances are there in order to craft the mise en scène in order for people to act perversely more.
And what would be a perverse act?
A perverse act would be an act in which there's complete certainty, which is why it's tied to the end of analysis, of course, blah, 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 because only a perverse act can deliver kind of change in symptom. But likewise, following the theme of love, beginning of Encore, Lacan says that love is the sign of a change of discourse, in which case there is an active love in this pervert, etc. I mean, you could tie it many places. I don't mean to go on.
Sure.
But so I'm asking. So the question, put simply, is: can we think of a dimension of neurosis as perversion, as the active perversion, as opposed to a separate structure or simply something nebulous?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it is generally, again, if you go back, if you read people like Fink, and if you read people like Miller, it is generally the neurotic who is turning up under the guise of the perverse analyst. When they're the person who turns up at your clinic saying I'm a pervert is generally a neurotic. Okay, so in one sense, I don't know, it's not an act. I'd have to think about that, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Arthur. Thank you so much, the audience, for questions and discussion.